You've got your army of miniatures, and you'd like to learn more about its lore in Warhammer 40K? That's perfect, because I've put together all the best books by faction. You can find all the links in the description, which saves you from having to search for them, and you can jump straight to your army thanks to the chapter markers. Enjoy the video! As soon as we start talking about the Imperial Guard, the first title I recommend is Gaunt's Ghosts. You follow Colonel Commissar Gaunt and his regiment, the Tanith First and Only, through campaigns where every mission can end very badly. What I really love about this series is that you're with ordinary humans. Not superhumans, not armored legends, but soldiers who doubt, who bleed, who die, and who you gradually become attached to. You feel the losses, the bonds within the unit, the fatigue of long campaigns. On the other hand, you have to be willing to embrace the military chronicle side of it, because over several books, some stretches can feel a little similar if you're looking for something more varied. If you like the Ultramarines, I would point you more toward Courage and Honor. You follow Uriel Ventress, and the novel does a very good job of highlighting the chapter's rigor, discipline, and sense of duty. What works well is that everything feels structured, the battles have real logic to them, and you can feel the weight of command and of the code. It's a very good choice if you want to understand why the Ultramarines are so often seen as the standard for the Imperial Space Marine. The weakness is that this same solidity can also make it feel a little too classic, almost too clean, if you prefer more unpredictable factions. Very different atmosphere with the Space Wolves, where I recommend the Space Wolf Omnibus. You follow Ragnar Blackmane from his very beginnings, and that is exactly what makes the book work so well. You discover their culture through his growth, his battles, his mistakes, and his gradual transformation. What I love in this novel is the sheer energy. This is something much more instinctive, much wilder than with the Ultramarines. There's a real identity to it. On the other hand, it's a big omnibus, and not every part hits with exactly the same intensity, so you have to accept a few sections that are a little less strong than the best moments. Whenever someone tells me they like the Blood Angels, I tend to recommend the Devastation of Baal. Here, you go straight into a massive war, with Dante having to defend Baal against Hive Fleet Leviathan. What really stands out to me is the feeling of being crushed. Even with Space Marines, even with experience, even with willpower, you feel that the Tyranid threat is simply too great. The book captures the sense of sacrifice and the tragic nobility of the Blood Angels extremely well. On the other hand, you do have to enjoy large-scale battles, because the novel is much more focused on massive warfare than on intimate character moments. For the Dark Angels, I would send you toward the Lion, Son of the Forest. You follow the return of Lion L. Johnson to a galaxy that has nothing in common anymore with the one he once knew. What I appreciate here is the contrast. This isn't just a war novel, it's also the perspective of a towering figure returning to a world he no longer recognizes. It gives the story something more restrained, more inward-looking, with real historical weight. On the other hand, the pacing is calmer than in other 40K novels, so you have to accept a slower progression. If you like sieges, wars of attrition, and desperate last stands, then Helsreach is an obvious choice. You follow Grimaldus in the defense of Hive Helsreach against the Orks, and the whole novel is built on that tension of holding out just a little bit longer. What I really like is the fatigue that keeps building, the constant pressure, the feeling that everything could break at any moment. The book conveys heroism under pressure very well. On the other hand, it is very dark from beginning to end, so there are very few moments where the story truly lets the tension breathe. To get into the Adeptus Mechanicus, I like recommending Day of Ascension. You are on a forge world, in a society controlled by the Mechanicus, where the human population lives under constant oppression. What is interesting is that the book does not just show techno-priests and machines. It also shows the concrete consequences of that order on the people living beneath it. I really like the atmosphere, the slow build of unease, and the political, almost social dimension of the story. On the other hand, you have to accept a slower novel, one that is less centered on direct frontline action. On the Adepta Sororitas side, I would point you toward the Emperor's Gift, if what you are looking for above all is faith taken to the extreme, sacrifice, and holy war against chaos. The book has real intensity in the way it handles devotion and martial purity. What I find powerful is that absolute conviction running all the way through the battles. On the other hand, I want to be honest. It is not the most completely focused novel on the sisters from beginning to end, and the very religious tone can feel a little heavy if you are looking for something more nuanced. With the Imperial Knights, I recommend Assassinorum Kingmaker. What I like about this novel is that it does not just show giant war machines fighting. You also get infiltration, power struggles, and political tensions, and that gives the story much more depth. The knights keep their noble and impressive side here, but without becoming pure spectacle. On the other hand, because the novel also looks beyond them, it is not necessarily the best choice if you want a book focused only on night battles. Once we move over to the Night Lords, I recommend Soul Hunter. You follow Talos and his warband, and what I find fascinating is that the book does not just present them as monsters. It shows violent characters, yes, but characters with a logic, a history, and their own very particular way of seeing the Imperium and their own downfall. The novel is extremely good at putting you inside the minds of renegade space marines, without making them sympathetic in a simplistic way. On the other hand, the tone is extremely dark, sometimes brutal, so you have to be ready for something fairly harsh. For the Death Guard, my recommendation remains the Buried Dagger. You are not simply looking at the faction after it is already corrupted, you are witnessing the moment when it truly tips over. And that is what I find so strong in this book, that feeling that everything is sliding, slowly and inevitably, toward Nurgle. Mortarion works very well as a tragic figure, because you see both his resistance and his inability to escape what awaits him. On the other hand, the novel sits within the larger Horus Heresy setting, so some references will carry more weight if you already know that era a little. For the Black Legion, I recommend what is called here Black Legion. What I like in this reading is the idea of rebuilding. After Horus falls, everything is fragmented, everything is broken, and you see how Abaddon gathers it together, imposes direction, and rebuilds a force out of chaos. The novel gives real depth to this idea of unifying legions that no longer have anything stable left. On the other hand, it is fairly dense, with a lot of contextual material, so it requires a bit more concentration than a more direct novel. With the World Eaters, Khârn, Eater of Worlds, is exactly what it needs to be. Brutal, furious, uncontrollable. What I like is that you really feel the total loss of control, violence turned into a way of life, almost into a permanent sentence. The book does a very good job of showing that this rage is not just spectacular, it is also a prison. On the other hand, you have to accept that the novel revolves heavily around destruction and confrontation, so if you want more variety in the situations, it can start to feel repetitive. For the Thousand Sons. A Thousand Sons is clearly a novel I recommend if you like intelligent tragedies. You follow Magnus and his legion through a gradual downfall that makes sense at every step. That is what makes the book so strong. You understand why they do what they do, even when you can already see the disaster coming. I really like that dimension of knowledge, pride, and good intentions going wrong. On the other hand, it is a dense novel, with a lot of ideas tied to the warp, knowledge, and sorcery, so it asks for a little more attention. As for the Chaos Demons in this selection, I recommend The Lords of Silence. The main appeal, for me, is the atmosphere. You are plunged into a universe consumed by Nurgle, corruption, decay, and the slow rot of everything that lives. It is very immersive, very heavy, almost physical in the way it is written. What I like is that you really feel the faction. On the other hand, you have to be ready to enter a very dark, very filthy, and not necessarily easy novel if you are looking for something lighter. When we move on to the Orks, I recommend Brutal Kunnin without hesitation. What I find brilliant about this book is that it fully embraces Ork logic. You are with Uthok Blackhawk, and you see the way they think, the way they approach war, fighting, and improvisation. It is both brutal and often funny in the way it tells its chaos. On the other hand, the very Ork, very unhinged tone may not work for everyone, especially if you like your Warhammer 40K constantly serious and solemn. For the Aeldari, Path of the Warrior remains a very good choice. You follow Corlandril, who leaves his life as an artist to enter a very strict warrior discipline. What I like in this novel is that idea of permanent control, that tension between mastery and loss of self. The book shows very well that an Aeldari does not simply fight, he also has to protect himself from himself. On the other hand, this is a fairly introspective story, so you have to accept a slower rhythm and fewer spectacular battles. If it is the Drukhari that draw you in, then Path of the Incubus is a very good immersion into Camera. You are in a society where everything revolves around betrayal, suffering, and power. What I like is that constant tension, that feeling that nobody can trust anybody. The novel conveys that organized cruelty extremely well. On the other hand, because it is a sequel, some relationships or stakes may feel a little less clear if you go in without context. For the Necrons, I recommend The Twice Dead King, Ruin. It is a novel that often surprises people because it gives much more depth to that faction than you might expect at first. You follow Ultix, a fallen noble, and the book shows very well what remains of a being who has lost his humanity without entirely losing the memory of what he once was. What I like is that cold melancholy, that reflection on honor, the past, and identity. On the other hand, it is quite introspective, so if you are looking for pure momentum and non-stop action, it may feel slow. For the Tau, I tend to recommend Firecast to people who enjoy more ambiguous stories. The novel does not give you a simple vision of the faction. It puts you in a very heavy, very psychological setting, with humans confronted by war and Tau ideology in an oppressive environment. What I like is precisely that ambiguity, that feeling that nothing is as clean or as simple as it seems. On the other hand, the style can be disorienting, sometimes almost confusing, so it is not necessarily the easiest read. To really feel what a Tyranid invasion is, I recommend The Devastation of Baal again, but this time from that angle. The novel works very well because it shows the Tyranids as a living catastrophe, a biological force that cannot be reasoned with and cannot be cleanly stopped. What I like is that feeling of inevitability, that rise of the threat that never truly stops. On the other hand, it is still a novel seen from the Defender's side, so you do not get a true internal Tyranid perspective. Finally, for the Genestealer cults, I want to come back to Day of Ascension, because it also works perfectly for that faction. Where the novel becomes really fascinating is in the way it shows how a society is infiltrated from within, how a cult can appear as hope to people who have nothing left. What I like is that gradual rise, almost invisible at first, which makes the threat feel even more believable. On the other hand, just as when reading it from the Mechanicus side, you have to accept a slower novel, one driven more by atmosphere and social tension than by pure action. In the end, the right Warhammer 40K book is not necessarily the most famous one, or the one most often recommended in general. More than anything, it is the one that matches your faction, your sensibility, and what you love in this universe.